The clock has just struck the hour. The shadows in the corner of your room are stretching just a little longer than they should, and you've tuned your dial to the only place where the impossible feels inevitable. Welcome to Channel 19 Mysteries. I'm your host, the Midnight Rider. Tonight, we're stepping off the map. We're looking into those jagged cracks in reality where logic fails and the laws of physics simply stop. We're talking about seasoned woodsmen who walk into sub-zero nights in their socks, never to be seen alive again. We're talking about men who vanish from the middle of frozen lakes only to wake up 15 months later in a different life, in cities that flicker into existence from a decade that should be dead and buried. Before we cross the veil into these accounts, do me a favor. If you have a hunger for the unexplained, hit that like button, subscribe to our frequency, and leave a comment below. Tell me, have you ever felt the world around you go thin? Have you ever seen something that shouldn't exist? I read every single one of your stories. Lock your doors. Turn down the lights. Now, let's get into tonight's stories. The perfect getaway. It was November of 2008. We're in a remote, rugged area of Quebec, Canada, near a place called Saint-Côme. This is the kind of area where the pine trees are so thick they block out the sun. And by the time November rolls around, the air doesn't just feel cold, it feels heavy. It's the kind of cold that gets into your bones and stays there. A man named Grégoire Bissonnette, a 53-year-old who was known by his friends as a rugged, capable, outdoorsy type, decided he needed a break. Grégoire wasn't a city slicker who got lost in his own backyard. He was a guy who knew the woods. He was a hunter, a hiker, and a man who valued his solitude. He owned a small, rustic cabin deep in these woods. It wasn't fancy. It was a place to chop wood, clear his head, and maybe track some deer. On this particular weekend, he packed up his truck, told his family he'd be back in a few days, and headed out into the wilderness. When he arrived at his cabin, the first thing he did was what any experienced woodsman would do. He started a fire. He settled in. The neighbors, or rather, the people who owned the nearest cabin about a mile away, later reported seeing smoke curling out of his chimney. Everything seemed perfectly normal. Grégoire was doing exactly what he loved to do. But when Sunday evening rolled around and Grégoire didn't pull into his driveway back home, his family started to worry. By Monday morning, that worry turned into full-blown panic. They called the Sûreté du Québec, the provincial police, and a search party was organized. When the investigators, led by a veteran officer named Sergeant Robert Miller, finally reached Grégoire's cabin, they expected to find one of two things. Either Grégoire had suffered a medical emergency inside, or he had gone out for a hike and gotten injured or lost in the brush. But when they stepped onto the porch, they noticed something strange. The door was unlocked. They walked inside, and the cabin was warm. Not residual heat warm, but there was a roaring fire here very recently, warm. On the table sat a half-eaten meal, a plate of food, a fork resting on the side, and a glass of water that was still half full. It looked as if Grégoire had been sitting there, eating his dinner, when something incredibly urgent had caused him to stand up and walk out the door. Sergeant Miller looked around. Grégoire's heavy winter coat was still hanging on the peg by the door. His boots, his rugged, insulated hiking boots were sitting right there on the mat. His keys, his wallet, and his cell phone were all resting on the counter. Now, remember, we are in the Canadian wilderness in November. It is well below freezing outside. There is snow on the ground. Nobody, especially not a seasoned woodsman like Grégoire, walks out into that environment without a coat and boots, unless they are in a state of absolute terror or complete mental break. But it got weirder. The search teams went outside and began surveying the perimeter of the cabin. Because of the fresh dusting of snow, they expected to find tracks. And they did. They found a single set of footprints leading away from the porch. The footprints were made by a man in his socks. The search party followed the sock prints. They led away from the cabin and straight into the dense tree line. They weren't erratic. They weren't the prints of someone running for their life. They were steady, purposeful strides. Grégoire Bissonnette had apparently decided to take a stroll into the freezing dark in his socks, without a coat, as if he were walking down a hallway in his own home. They followed the tracks for about 500 yards until they reached a small clearing, and that's where the tracks just stopped. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no marks in the snow suggesting he had been grabbed or dragged, no animal tracks, no wolves, no bears, just a set of human footprints that ended abruptly in the middle of a clearing. It was as if Grégoire Bissonnette had simply been lifted off the face of the earth. The police brought in canine units. They brought in helicopters with thermal imaging. They spent days combing every square inch of that forest. They found nothing. No body, no clothing, not even a scrap of fabric. 6 months passed. The snow melted, the spring thaw came, and the mystery of Grégoire Bissonnette became a local legend, a ghost story for the people of Saint-Côme. In May of 2009, 2 hikers, Brian Fletcher and Kevin O'Malley, were exploring a ridge about 2 miles away from Grégoire's cabin. This ridge was incredibly difficult to reach. It involved scaling a steep, rocky incline that most people wouldn't even attempt without climbing gear. As they reached the top, Brian noticed something bright sitting near the base of a large pine tree. He walked over, thinking it was trash left behind by another hiker. It was a pair of socks. They were tucked neatly together, side by side, as if someone had taken them off and placed them there with great care. A few feet away, they found Grégoire Bissonnette. He was lying on his back, looking up at the sky. His body was remarkably well preserved because of the freezing temperatures of the winter. But when the coroner, Dr. Amanda Sterling, performed the autopsy, the results raised more questions than they answered. Grégoire hadn't died of a heart attack. He hadn't been murdered. He hadn't fallen and hit his head. The cause of death was listed as hypothermia, but there was a problem, a big one. To get to that ridge, Grégoire would have had to walk 2 miles through thorns, jagged rocks, and frozen slush in his socks. Yet, when Dr. Sterling examined his feet, there were no cuts, no bruises, no signs that he had walked even 100 yards without shoes, let alone 2 miles over punishing terrain. His feet were as clean as if he'd been walking on a carpet. And then there was the paradoxical undressing. Now, for those who don't know, in the final stages of hypothermia, the brain sometimes malfunctions. The victim feels a sudden, intense sensation of heat, even though they are freezing to death. This causes them to strip off their clothes. It's called paradoxical undressing. But that didn't fit here. Grégoire wasn't wearing his clothes to begin with. He left them in the cabin. He started his journey in a state that usually only happens at the end of a journey. And then there was the terminal burrowing. This is another phenomenon where hypothermia victims try to crawl into small enclosed spaces, like under a log or into a crevice to protect themselves. But Grégoire didn't do that. He was found in the wide open, on top of a ridge, in a spot that was nearly impossible to reach. The investigators were left with a haunting sequence of events. 1. A man is eating a peaceful dinner in a warm cabin. 2. He suddenly stands up, leaves his food, leaves his shoes, leaves his coat, and walks out into the sub-zero night. 3. He walks 2 miles over razor-sharp terrain in his socks without damaging them. 4. He climbs a vertical ridge that would challenge a professional athlete. 5. He neatly removes his socks and lies down to die. Years later, a private investigator named Mark Whitaker took another look at the file. He spoke to the neighbors who had seen the smoke from the chimney. One of them, an elderly man named Arthur Vance, mentioned something he hadn't told the police at the time because he thought it sounded crazy. Arthur said that on the night Grégoire vanished, he had been out on his porch smoking a cigar. He looked over toward Grégoire's cabin on the hill. He saw the smoke, but he also saw something else. He saw lights, not flashlights, and not the glow of the cabin windows. He described them as dancing lights, in the trees' bluish-white orbs that seemed to move with a strange, rhythmic intelligence. He watched them for 10 minutes as they hovered near Grégoire's door and then drifted slowly toward the ridge where the body was eventually found. Was Grégoire Bissonnette following something? Was he in a trance? Or was there someone or something in that cabin with him that night? Someone who didn't leave tracks in the snow. To this day, the death of Grégoire Bissonnette is officially closed as an accidental death due to environmental exposure. But if you talk to the people in Saint-Côme or the searchers who saw those tracks end in the middle of a clearing, they'll tell you a different story. They'll tell you that whatever happened in that cabin wasn't an accident, it was an invitation, and Grégoire Bissonnette was the only one who heard it. The Shore of No Return. It was February 17, 1978. We're in Saugatuck, Michigan, right on the edge of Lake Michigan. Now, if you've never been to the Great Lakes in the dead of winter, let me tell you, it's not just a lake. It's an inland sea. And in February, it's a terrifying landscape of jagged ice shelves, blinding whiteouts, and lake-effect snow that can bury a car in minutes. A 23-year-old college student named Steven Kubacki decided this was the perfect time to go on a solo cross-country skiing trip. Now, Steven wasn't a novice. He was a student at Hope College, he was an experienced outdoorsman, and he was known for being highly intelligent and very capable. He told his friends he was heading out for a quick overnight trip to clear his head. He packed his backpack, grabbed his skis and poles, and headed toward the frozen shoreline. When Steven didn't show up for class on Monday, his friends weren't immediately worried he was a free spirit type. But by Tuesday, when his apartment remained empty and no one had heard from him, they called the police. The search party that went out looking for Steven Kubacki was one of the most thorough in Michigan's history. They had snowmobiles, helicopters, and expert trackers. And because of the fresh snow, they found exactly what they were looking for almost immediately. The searchers followed the twin grooves of Steven's skis through the woods and out onto the massive frozen expanse of the Lake Michigan ice shelf. The tracks were steady. They didn't show any sign of hesitation. Steven was skiing with purpose, heading further and further out away from the safety of the shore. They followed those tracks for about 200 yards onto the ice. And then they found Steven's gear. Sitting right there in the middle of the ice was Steven's backpack. His skis were leaned up against it. His poles were stuck firmly into the snow. It looked exactly like he had just stopped to take a break or maybe snap a photo. But there was no Steven. The searchers looked ahead of the skis, expecting to see footprints leading away. Maybe he'd taken his skis off to walk on a patch of clear ice. But there were no footprints. There were no marks in the snow at all. The ski tracks led to the gear, and then nothing. Now, the first thought everyone had was the most logical one. He fell through the ice. But the searchers checked the area with extreme care. There were no cracks. There were no soft spots. The ice where his gear was sitting was nearly a foot thick and solid as a rock. There was no hole for him to have fallen into. For the next several days, helicopters flew patterns over the lake. Divers went under the ice near the shore just in case. They found absolutely zero trace of Steven Kubacki. No body, no clothing, no extra gear. He had effectively vanished from a flat, white, featureless surface while being watched by nothing but the wind. After a week, the search was called off. Steven's family held a memorial service. His name was added to the list of people claimed by the Great Lakes. Steven Kubacki was dead. Fast forward 15 months. It is now May 5, 1979. We are in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. That is over 700 miles away from the frozen shores of Saugatuck, Michigan. A young man is lying in a grassy field in the middle of the Berkshire Mountains. He's wearing clothes that don't quite fit right, a pair of sneakers he doesn't recognize, and a t-shirt he doesn't remember buying. He wakes up, looks around, and feels a massive, pounding headache. He sees a group of hikers nearby and stumbles over to them. He looks disoriented, his skin is pale, and he asks them a question that stops them in their tracks. Where am I? And what day is it? The man was Steven Kubacki. But here is where the strange turns into the impossible. When the police arrived and identified him, they were stunned. Steven had no idea he had been missing for 15 months. To him, it felt like he had just closed his eyes in Michigan and opened them in Massachusetts. He told the investigators that the last thing he remembered was feeling a bit cold while skiing on Lake Michigan. He felt a sudden, overwhelming wave of exhaustion, and he decided to lay down for a quick nap. When he woke up in the grass in Pittsfield, he was carrying a small satchel. Inside that satchel were maps of locations he had never visited and a hitchhiker's guide. But Steven had no memory of hitchhiking. He had no memory of the winter of 1978. He had missed an entire year of human history, and his brain had simply deleted it. The investigators tried to trace Steven's lost year. They looked for anyone who might have seen a man matching his description, hitchhiking across the Midwest. They checked shelters, hospitals, and hostels. They found a few scattered reports. A man fitting Steven's description had been seen in various towns in the Northeast, always quiet, always moving, appearing almost like a sleepwalker. But the timeline made no sense. There were gaps of months where he simply wasn't anywhere. But the most chilling detail came when Steven went back to Michigan to see his family. He was a different person. His friends said the spark he used to have was gone. He was colder, more distant, and he became obsessed with maps, specifically maps of the stars. He eventually went on to become a psychologist, and for 40 years, he refused to talk to the media about what happened. He lived a quiet, professional life, but in his later years, he finally released a memoir where he hinted at something that sounds like it's straight out of a science fiction movie. He didn't describe being kidnapped by people. He didn't describe a fugue state brought on by stress. Instead, he described a sensation of being pulled through a doorway. He talked about multiversal experiences of living other lives in other places that didn't feel like Earth. If you look at the Steven Kubacki case from a purely skeptical perspective, you have to answer one question that no one has ever been able to solve. How did he get off the ice? Remember, the searchers were there within 24 hours of his disappearance. They found his tracks in fresh snow. Those tracks led out onto the lake, but no tracks led back. If Steven had decided to fake his own death and walk away, he would have had to walk back toward the shore, leaving a second set of tracks. Or he would have had to continue walking across miles of shifting, treacherous ice to the other side of the lake, a feat that is considered physically impossible for a human being without specialized equipment and a support team. And yet, his gear, the very things he would need to survive that journey, was left behind, neatly placed in the center of the ice. There are people who believe Steven stepped into a portal, a thin spot in reality, often associated with the Lake Michigan Triangle. Others believe it was a highly sophisticated dissociative fugue, where his brain snapped and he somehow navigated 700 miles as a ghost. But if you ask the people who were on that ice in 1978, the people who saw those tracks end in a perfect circle of undisturbed snow, they'll tell you that Steven Kubacki didn't walk away. He was taken. And 15 months later, whatever took him simply decided to put him back. The man from nowhere. The year was 1950. We are in Tokyo, Japan, at Haneda Airport. Now, this was a time when international travel was still a luxury, and the world was just beginning to open up after the devastation of World War II. Security was tight, but it wasn't the digital, biometric-heavy gauntlet we know today. It was a world of paper passports, ink stamps, and face-to-face questioning. A man stepped off a plane from Europe. He was tall, well-dressed, and carried himself with the quiet confidence of a seasoned businessman. He spoke several languages, including French and Japanese, and he blended perfectly into the crowd of travelers until he reached the customs desk. When the customs officer, a man named Sato Hiroshi, asked for his passport, the traveler handed it over with a polite smile. Sato opened the document and his brow furrowed. The passport looked official. It was bound in high-quality leather. It had the man's photo, and it was covered in dozens of entry and exit stamps from major cities across the globe: Paris, Madrid, London, Tokyo. But there was one glaring, impossible problem. The country listed as the man's home was a place called Taured. Sato Hiroshi looked up at the man and said, "Sir, where is this country? I have never heard of Taured." The man looked at Sato as if he were joking. He laughed and said, "Taured? It is right there, between France and Spain. It has been there for 1,000 years. Surely you are kidding." Sato pulled out a map of Europe and laid it on the desk. He pointed to the small mountainous region between France and Spain, the area we know today as the Principality of Andorra. The man looked at the map, and his face went white. He pointed at Andorra and said, "That is where Taured should be. Why does the map say Andorra? What have you done with my country?" The man became increasingly agitated. He insisted that he was a businessman on a routine trip to Japan. He showed the officers his driver's license, issued by the government of Taured. He showed them his bank records and his business cards. Every single document looked legitimate. They had official seals, holograms of the time, and professional printing. But they all said Taured. The customs officers were at a total loss. They didn't know if they were dealing with a spy, a madman, or a very elaborate prankster. They decided to detain the man until they could verify his story. They took the man to a nearby hotel, a high-rise building, with a single entrance and exit. They put him in a room on the 15th floor. To ensure he didn't leave, they stationed 2 armed guards outside his door. They took his passport and all his documents and locked them in a safe at the airport. Inside the room, the man was heard pacing back and forth, muttering in a language the guards couldn't quite identify. The next morning, Sato Hiroshi and a team of investigators arrived at the hotel to conduct a more formal interview. They knocked on the door. No answer. They knocked again, louder this time. Still, silence. Sato used a master key to open the door. The room was empty. The bed was neatly made. The man's luggage, which had been placed in the corner of the room, was gone. But here's the part that defies any logical explanation. The windows were locked from the inside. There was no balcony. We are talking about a 15-story room with a sheer drop to the street below. The 2 guards outside the door swore on their lives that the door had never opened. No one had entered, and no one had left. The investigators rushed back to the airport to check the safe. They opened it, expecting to find the man's mysterious Taured passport as the only evidence he ever existed. The safe was empty. The passport, the bank records, and the business cards had all vanished into thin air. Now, if that was the only story of its kind, we might write it off as an urban legend. But there is another, perhaps more well-documented case of an impossible reappearance that happened in 1851. We are in Frankfurt in der Oder, Germany. A man is found wandering the streets, looking completely dazed. He's wearing clothes that look vaguely European, but aren't quite in style for the mid-1800s. He speaks a broken form of German, but he primarily speaks a language he calls Laxarian. He is brought before the authorities, and they ask him who he is and where he comes from. The man identifies himself as Jofar Vorin. He tells the officials that he comes from a country called Laxaria, which is located on a continent called Sakria. The authorities, much like the customs officers in Japan a century later, pull out a world map. Jofar Vorin looks at the map with total confusion. He says he doesn't recognize the shapes of the continents. He says the world he knows is divided into 5 great compartments, and Laxaria is the most powerful nation in the north. He told them he was searching for his long-lost brother and had been traveling by ship. He said his ship had been caught in a mist, and when the mist cleared, he found himself standing on a road in Germany. The German authorities held Jofar Vorin for several months. They studied his language, which had a structured grammar and a complex vocabulary, but bore no resemblance to any known Indo-European language. They eventually sent him to Berlin to be studied by scientists. But just like the man from Taured, Jofar Vorin eventually disappeared. He wasn't found dead, and he didn't escape his confinement. He simply faded away from the historical record. These stories point to a phenomenon that some researchers call parallel slippage. Think about the world as a radio. Usually, we are tuned to one frequency, our reality. But sometimes, for reasons we don't understand, the signal gets crossed. A man from a version of Earth where Endora is called towered accidentally steps through a doorway and finds himself in our world. But because he doesn't belong here, because his physical atoms are tuned to a different frequency, our reality eventually rejects him. He is pulled back, like a rubber band snapping into place, taking his documents and his luggage with him. But what happens when the reappearance isn't a stranger, but someone we know? In 1987, a man named David Collins vanished while hiking in the Great Smoky Mountains. A massive search was conducted, but no trace of him was ever found. He was declared dead in 1994. Then, in 2002, 15 years after he disappeared, David Collins walked into a police station in a small town in Oregon. He was wearing the exact same clothes he had been wearing on the day he vanished in 1987. The clothes weren't tattered or worn out. They looked brand new. His hiking boots still had the factory tread on them. But the most terrifying part? David Collins hadn't aged a single day. To the police, he looked like a 24-year-old man. But according to his birth certificate, he should have been 39. When they interviewed him, David was terrified. He said he had been hiking, he saw a shimmer in the air between two trees, and he walked through it thinking it was just a trick of the light. He said he walked for about 10 minutes, came out the other side, and saw a police station. To David, he had only been gone for 10 minutes. To the rest of the world, 15 years had passed. These cases are rarely talked about in polite scientific circles because they violate the most fundamental rule of our universe, that time moves in one direction, at one speed, for everyone. But for Sato Hiroshi, who saw a man vanish from a locked 15th story room, and for the family of David Collins, who looked into the eyes of a son who was younger than his own younger brother, the mystery is very real. The scariest part isn't the idea that there are other worlds or time slips. The scariest part is the idea that the world we live in, the one we think is solid and permanent, is actually quite fragile. It's like a piece of fabric that has been washed too many times. It's getting thin in some places. And if you happen to be standing on one of those thin spots when the wind blows just right, you might find yourself in a country that doesn't exist, clutching a passport that no one recognizes, waiting for a reality that has already forgotten you. The moss-draped cathedral. The year was 1999. We are in Olympic National Park, Washington. Now, if you've never been to the Olympics, it is one of the most rugged and beautiful places on the planet. It's a temperate rainforest, where the rainfall is measured in feet, not inches. The ground is covered in a carpet of neon green moss so thick it muffles every sound, and the Douglas firs and western red cedars reach up like the pillars of a Gothic cathedral. It is a place of profound beauty, but it is also a place that does not suffer fools. Our main character today is a man named John Henderson. Now, John wasn't a tourist. He was a 54-year-old local who had spent 30 years hiking, hunting, and fishing in these exact woods. He was the kind of guy who didn't need a GPS because he knew the shape of the ridges and the flow of the creeks like the back of his own hand. He was fit, he was prepared, and he was deeply respected in the local community of Port Angeles. On an unseasonably warm afternoon in October, John told his wife, Brenda, that he was going to head up toward the deer park area. He wanted to scout some trails for an upcoming elk season. He grabbed his day pack, his binoculars, and a light jacket. He told Brenda he'd be back by 6 p.m., plenty of time to wash up before dinner. John drove his truck to the trailhead, laced up his boots, and stepped into the forest. At around 4:30 p.m., another group of hikers, a couple named Robert and Susan Miller, were heading down the same trail John was heading up. They passed John near a section of the trail called the Blue Mountain Overlook. They exchanged a brief, friendly greeting. Robert would later tell investigators that John seemed perfectly normal. He wasn't panting, he wasn't disoriented, and he certainly didn't look like a man who was about to have a medical emergency. He was just a guy enjoying a walk in his favorite place on Earth. Robert and Susan continued down the trail. About 5 minutes later, they realized they had dropped a lens cap for their camera. Robert told Susan to wait on the trail while he jogged back up to where they had just seen John, thinking the lens cap might be right there on the path. Robert reached the spot where they had spoken to John. He found the lens cap. He looked up the trail, expecting to see John's back moving away through the trees. The trail was a straight shot for at least 200 yards. There were no major turns, no thick brush on either side, just open, high-altitude forest. John Henderson was gone. Robert called out, "Hey, John, you still there?" Silence. Now, in the Olympics, sound doesn't travel well because of the moss. But 5 minutes is not enough time for a 54-year-old man to walk out of earshot on an uphill grade. Robert walked another 100 yards up the trail, shouting John's name. He saw no one. He heard nothing but the wind whistling through the fir needles. He shrugged it off, thinking John must have a much faster pace than he looked, and headed back down to Susan. 6 p.m. came and went. Brenda Henderson sat at the kitchen table, watching the clock. By 8 p.m., she was calling the National Park Service. Because John was so experienced, the park rangers took the call seriously immediately. By daybreak the next morning, a full-scale search and rescue operation was underway. They had helicopters with forward-looking infrared cameras. They had 25 ground teams. They had K9 units. The searchers started at the exact spot where Robert Miller had last seen John. And this is where the mystery moves from a missing person case to something truly unsettling. The K9 handler, a veteran named Detective Gary Vance, brought in a bloodhound named Samson. Samson was a legendary tracker. He had found lost children in the middle of snowstorms. Vance gave Samson a scent article, one of John's unwashed t-shirts. Samson picked up the scent immediately. He pulled hard on the leash, leading the team to the exact spot on the trail where the Millers had greeted John. Samson let out a deep, mournful howl, a sound he usually reserved for when he found a deceased subject. But then, Samson started circling. He didn't lead them up the trail. He didn't lead them down into the brush. He just walked in a tight, frantic circle right there on the path. Suddenly, Samson stopped. He looked up into the air, whined, and then tucked his tail between his legs and sat down. He refused to move. Gary Vance had never seen anything like it. It was as if the scaffold of John's scent had simply been cut off at the knees. 1 second he was there, and the next, his chemical signature had been erased from the earth. The search continued for 10 days. They searched every ravine, every hollow log, and every rock crevice within a 5-mile radius of the overlook. On the 8th day, a volunteer named Mark Thompson was searching a drainage, a steep, rocky gully about 2 miles away from the last known sighting. This drainage was incredibly treacherous. It was a 60-degree slope covered in loose shale. Even the most elite search teams had bypassed it, thinking no sane person would ever try to climb down it. Mark looked down and saw something blue. He scrambled down the slope, risking a fall, and reached the object. It was a light windbreaker jacket. He picked it up and saw the name Henderson written in permanent marker on the collar. But as he looked around, his blood ran cold. Lying next to the jacket were John's binoculars. They were sitting on a flat rock, perfectly balanced. And next to the binoculars were John's boots. They weren't thrown there. They hadn't fallen there. They were placed side by side, pointing toward the mountain peak with the laces neatly tucked inside. There was no body. There were no socks. There were no other clothes. Just a jacket, a pair of boots, and binoculars were sitting in the middle of a vertical shale slope that was nearly impossible to access. The investigators were baffled. If John had suffered a mental break, what they call a fugue state, he might have stripped off his clothes. But paradoxical undressing usually happens in the final stages of hypothermia, and the weather that week had been mild. Furthermore, how did he get there? To reach that gully from the trail in 5 minutes, John would have had to run at Olympic sprinter speeds across a vertical cliff face without leaving a single scuff mark on his boots. When the news of the placed boots reached the local indigenous elders, members of the Quileute and Clallam tribes, they told the searchers to stop looking. They spoke of a thinness in the Olympics. They believe that there are certain valleys of smoke where the physical world and the spirit world overlap. They claimed that John hadn't gotten lost. He had accidentally walked into a long house that wasn't built of wood or stone, but of time itself. They pointed to the fact that the K9 had looked up before losing the scent. In their lore, the great bird, or the whirlwind, doesn't take the body, it takes the essence, leaving the heavy things, the boots, the tools behind in a neat pile, as if they were being returned to the earth. 2 years later, in 2001, a hiker found a skull at the top of a peak 3 miles in the opposite direction from the gully. DNA testing confirmed it was John Henderson. But here is the final terrifying detail. The skull was found on a ledge that was completely inaccessible by foot. The only way to get there was by helicopter or by being an expert rock climber with full gear. The medical examiner, Dr. Sarah Jenkins, noted that there were no animal gnaw marks on the bone. There was no scatter of other remains. It was just a clean, weathered skull sitting on a high altitude ledge, looking out over the valley. How did John Henderson, a man who vanished in 5 minutes, lose his boots in a gully 2 miles away, only to have his remains end up on a vertical cliff 3 miles in the other direction? To this day, the Henderson case is whispered about in Port Angeles. Some say he was a victim of a highly sophisticated predator. Others say he was the victim of a glitch in the park's geography. But if you ever find yourself hiking in the Olympic National Park and you pass someone on the trail, don't just say hello. Keep your eyes on them. Because in these woods, 5 minutes is all it takes for the world to decide it doesn't want you in this century anymore. The academic holiday. It was August 10, 1901. We are in Versailles, France, just outside of Paris. The air is thick, humid, and heavy, the kind of late summer heat that makes everything feel like it's moving through molasses. 2 women, Anne Moberly and Eleanor Jourdain, were visiting the Palace of Versailles. Now, these weren't just random tourists. These were high-level academics from England. Anne Moberly was the principal of St. Hugh's College at Oxford, and Eleanor Jourdain was her vice principal. These were women of logic, women of science, and women who prided themselves on their objective, rational view of the world. They weren't looking for ghosts, and they certainly weren't looking for a hole in time. After touring the main palace, they decided to walk toward the Petit Trianon. For those who don't know, the Petit Trianon is a smaller chateau on the grounds of Versailles that was famously the private retreat of Marie Antoinette. It's surrounded by lush gardens, winding paths, and ornamental forests. As Anne and Eleanor started walking down the path toward the Trianon, something shifted. They would later describe it as a sudden heaviness. The birds, which had been chirping loudly in the trees just seconds before, went completely silent. The wind died down. The very atmosphere around them felt like it had become unnatural and unpleasant. Anne would later write that it felt as if they were walking into a vacuum, or as if they were suddenly viewing the world through a flat, sepia-toned photograph. As they continued down the path, they realized they were lost. They weren't where the map said they should be. The landscape had changed. The well-manicured gardens of 1901 were gone, replaced by a wilder, more overgrown terrain. They rounded a corner and saw 2 men. Now, these men weren't dressed like gardeners of the early 1900s. They were wearing long, green, hooded coats and small, tri-cornered hats. They looked like something out of a period drama from the late 1700s. Anne and Eleanor, being polite English ladies, stopped and asked the men for directions to the Petit Trianon. The men looked at the women with an expression of dazed confusion. They spoke in a dialect of French that Eleanor, who was fluent in the language, found incredibly archaic and difficult to understand. They pointed toward a path and told the women to keep going. As the women walked away, they noticed that the men didn't seem solid. Their movements were stiff, almost like mechanical figures in an old clock. A few minutes later, they came across a small gazebo, or a kiosk. Sitting on the steps of this gazebo was a man, and as soon as Anne saw him, she felt a wave of pure, unadulterated revulsion. The man was wearing a dark cloak and a large slouch hat. His face was pitted with smallpox scars, and he had a dark, sinister expression. He didn't look at them. He stared straight ahead with unseeing eyes. Anne felt an aura of evil emanating from him that was so strong she physically recoiled. Suddenly, a voice shouted from behind them, "Monsieur! Monsieur! Not that way!" A young, handsome man with long, flowing hair and a flamboyant hat came running toward them. He told them, with great urgency, that they must cross a small bridge and head toward the house. They crossed the bridge and arrived at the Petit Trianon. But it wasn't the tourist attraction they had seen in photographs. It looked alive. There were no crowds, no roped-off areas, and no signs. And that's when they saw her. Sitting on a stool on the grass, right in front of the chateau, was a woman. She was sketching in a book. She had a light-colored dress on, a long white fichu, type of scarf, draped over her shoulders, and a large floppy hat covering her hair. As Anne walked past her, the woman turned and looked directly at her. Anne noted that she wasn't particularly young, but she was striking. Her face was pale, and she looked incredibly sad, not just unhappy, but deeply, profoundly mournful. Anne and Eleanor walked past her and toward a door on the side of the building. As they stepped through the threshold, it was like a snap. The silence vanished. The sound of tourists laughing, the rustle of the wind in the trees, and the chirping of birds all came rushing back in an instant. They turned around to look at the woman on the lawn, but the lawn was empty. The bridge they had just crossed was gone. The gazebo was nowhere to be seen. They were back in 1901. When Anne and Eleanor returned to Oxford, they couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. They were academics. They needed to understand. So they started doing something that most people in their position wouldn't do. They started deep diving into the archives of the French National Library. And what they found was enough to chill anyone to the bone. First, they looked for the men in green. They discovered that the official uniform for the Swiss Guard at Versailles in the 1770s, the men who guarded the private gardens, was exactly what they had seen. Green hooded coats and tri-cornered hats. Next, they looked for the sinister man at the gazebo. They found a description of a man named the Comte de Vaudreuil, a close friend of Marie Antoinette, who was famously scarred by smallpox and known for his dark and brooding temperament. Then, they looked for the young man who had directed them toward the bridge. They found a record of a page who had been sent to warn the Queen on a very specific day, October 5, 1789. That was the day the Parisian mob marched on Versailles. That was the day the monarchy effectively ended. Finally, they looked into the sketches and diaries of Marie Antoinette. They found a description of the Queen's favorite dress from the summer of 1789. It was a light-colored gown with a white fichu and a large, shaded hat. Anne Moberly and Eleanor Jourdain realized they hadn't just seen ghosts. They had stepped into a loop of time. They had witnessed the gardens of Versailles exactly as they appeared on one of the most terrifying days of the French Revolution. But the smoking gun of this case, the thing that makes it an impossible mystery, came years later. When Anne and Eleanor first published their account in a book called An Adventure, skeptics attacked them. They said the women had simply gotten lost and imagined the whole thing. They pointed out that the gazebo and the small bridge they described didn't exist in 1901 and hadn't existed for over 100 years. However, in the 1910s, historians discovered an old, dusty map that had been hidden in a wall during the Revolution. It was the personal map of Marie Antoinette's gardener. On that map, in the exact locations where Anne and Eleanor said they had seen them, were a gazebo and a small wooden bridge. These structures had been torn down in the early 1790s, shortly after the Queen was executed. There was no way for two Oxford professors in 1901 to know those structures were there. They weren't in any history books. They weren't on any public maps. The only way to know they existed was to have been there when they were standing. So, what happened to Anne and Eleanor? Some physicists believe they experienced a time slip, a rare atmospheric or magnetic event where 2 points in time fold over each other, allowing a temporary bridge to form. Others believe they experienced a stone tape haunting, where the intense emotions of Marie Antoinette's final days were recorded into the very stones and soil of the garden. But there is a third, more unsettling theory. Anne and Eleanor didn't just see the past saw them. Remember the man who shouted at them to keep going, and the woman who looked up from her sketching with a look of profound sadness? If Marie Antoinette was sitting in her garden on the day her world was about to end, and she suddenly saw two women in strange 20th century clothing walking through her private retreat, she would have been terrified. To her, Anne and Eleanor were the ghosts. To this day, people still report strange occurrences at the Petit Trianon. They report sudden silences, the smell of 18th century perfume, and the sight of a woman in a wide-brimmed hat sketching on a lawn that has been empty for over 200 years. But if you ever find yourself walking the grounds of Versailles on a hot, heavy August afternoon, and the birds suddenly stop singing, don't ask for directions. Just turn around and walk the other way, because you might find yourself walking into a year that you can't get back out of. The street that isn't there. The year was 1996. We're in Liverpool, England, specifically on a bustling commercial stretch called Bold Street. Now, Bold Street is famous for two things: its high-end boutiques and its bizarre reputation for physics-defying anomalies. A man named Frank, a 40-something off-duty policeman who was as grounded and no-nonsense as they come, was walking down Bold Street with his wife, Carol. It was a typical Saturday afternoon. The street was crowded with shoppers. The sound of modern car engines filled the air, and the storefronts were covered in neon signs and glass displays for 90 Seconds Electronics. Frank realized he needed to pick up a gift for his daughter, so he told Carol he was going to duck into a music store called HMV just a block away. Carol decided to keep heading toward a bookstore further down. They agreed to meet up in 20 minutes. Frank turned the corner, walking with purpose. But as he crossed the intersection of Hanover Street, he felt a sudden, sickening sensation in the pit of his stomach. It wasn't pain, it was more like the feeling you get when an elevator drops too quickly. Suddenly, the noise of the city died. The roar of the buses, the chatter of the crowds, the distant hum of the city's power grid, it all vanished. Frank stopped in his tracks. He looked down at the ground. A second ago, he had been walking on modern, smooth asphalt. Now, he was standing on cobblestones. Frank looked up, and his heart nearly stopped. The HMV music store, the massive, modern building he had seen just seconds ago, was gone. In its place stood a small, dusty storefront with a wooden sign that read, Dillon's. He looked around in a panic. The cars were gone. In their place were old-fashioned delivery vans with rounded fenders and manual cranks on the front. People were walking past him, but they weren't wearing jeans or sneakers. The men were in heavy wool overcoats and fedoras. The women were wearing long skirts and headscarves. Frank, being a policeman, immediately looked for a logical explanation. He thought, maybe they're filming a movie? He looked for cameras, for lighting rigs, for a director in a folding chair. He saw nothing but a living, breathing city. And then he saw the van, a large, green delivery truck with the name of a local dairy painted on the side in hand-lettered gold paint rattled past him. Frank reached out and touched the brickwork of the building next to him. It felt cold. It felt real. It felt ancient. He looked at the storefront of Dillon's again. Inside the window, he didn't see CDs or posters for Britpop bands. He saw umbrellas. Hand-stitched, silk-lined umbrellas displayed on velvet racks. Frank felt a hand on his shoulder. He spun around, his hand instinctively reaching for where his radio would be. A young man in his 20s was standing there. He was wearing a flat cap and a dirty canvas vest. The man looked at Frank with an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. The man whispered, "You shouldn't be here, mate. You look like you're from the future." Before Frank could respond, the man turned and bolted down an alleyway. Frank felt that elevator drop sensation again. His ears popped like he was descending in a plane. The silence shattered. The sound of a bus's air brakes hissed right next to him. The neon lights of the HMV store flickered back into existence. The cobblestones beneath his feet smoothed out into asphalt. He was back in 1996. Frank was shaking. He checked his watch. He had only been gone for what felt like 2 minutes. He ran down the street and found Carol. She was standing exactly where they had agreed to meet, looking at her own watch. "Frank, where have you been?" she asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Frank told her everything. He expected her to laugh, to tell him he'd had a stroke or a vivid daydream. But Carol didn't laugh. She turned pale, because while Frank was gone, she had been looking for him. She had walked back toward the intersection where he vanished. And she said for about 30 seconds, the entire street had seemed to blur, and she couldn't see any of the buildings clearly. Frank couldn't let it go. He was a cop. He needed evidence. He went to the Liverpool City Archives and started looking at old photographs of Bold Street. He found a photo from 1944. In the photo, right where the HMV stood in 1996, was a small shop called Dillon's. It was an umbrella shop. The sign, the window display, the exact shade of the brickwork, it was identical to what Frank had seen. But it got weirder. He looked into the green van. He found a registry of local businesses from the 1940s. There was a dairy called Reese's that operated a fleet of delivery trucks in that area during World War II. Their color? Forest green with gold lettering. Frank wasn't the only one. In the years following his report, dozens of people came forward with nearly identical stories about Bold Street. There was Sean Murphy, who in 2006 claimed he was walking to the bank and suddenly found himself surrounded by Victorian-era carriage drivers. There was Sarah Thompson, who in the 1980s claimed she walked into a thrift store on Bold Street that was filled with brand new, high-end 1950s clothing, only to find the store replaced by an empty, boarded-up lot when she returned 5 minutes later with her sister. So, why Bold Street? Geologists have noted that Liverpool is built on a massive bed of sandstone. Some researchers, like Michael Goss, believe that sandstone, which contains high levels of quartz, can act as a natural recording medium. They suggest that under certain atmospheric conditions, or perhaps due to the city's underground rail system creating specific magnetic frequencies, the sandstone plays back images of the past. But Frank's story suggests it's not just a recording. He didn't just see a movie. He interacted with it. He felt the cold bricks. The man in the flat cap saw him. This points to a time slip, a literal tear in the fabric of space-time. Think of reality like a stack of transparent sheets. Usually, we only see the top sheet, the now. But occasionally, a corner of the sheet folds over, and for a brief moment, 2 different years are occupying the exact same physical coordinates. There are people who believe that if Frank had followed that man into the alleyway, he might never have come back. They believe there are holes in Bold Street that stay open longer than others, and that some of the city's missing persons cases aren't murders or runaways. They're people who simply took a wrong turn into the wrong decade. Years after his experience, Frank went back to Bold Street. He stood on the same corner, hoping or maybe fearing that it would happen again. It didn't. But as he was leaving, he noticed something in the window of a modern boutique. It was a vintage-style display, a tribute to the street's history. And there, tucked in the corner, was an old black umbrella with a silk lining. He looked at the tag. It was an antique, dated 1944. Frank walked away, but he never forgot the man in the alleyway, the man who looked at a modern human and saw a ghost. Because on Bold Street, the past isn't behind us. It's right next to us, separated by nothing more than a thin, shivering veil of air. And if you're not careful where you step, you might just find yourself walking into a history book that you can't close. The veil has settled back into place, at least for now. 6 stories, 6 lives that brushed against the jagged edges of a world we think we understand, only to find that the ground beneath our feet is far more fragile than we dare to admit. Whether it's a man in his socks on a frozen ridge, a hiker whose gear is returned by the wind, or a street in Liverpool that remembers a war that ended 80 years ago, the message is clear. Reality is not a solid wall. It's a shivering curtain. I want to thank you for riding with me through the dark tonight. If these stories made the air in your room feel just a little bit colder, do me a favor, hit that like button and subscribe to Channel 19 Mysteries. Your support is the only thing that keeps this frequency alive. And before I fade back into the static, I want to hear from you. Have you stepped through a doorway that shouldn't have been there? Have you seen the dancing lights in the trees? Or felt the world go silent on a busy street? If you have a story, a creepy encounter, or an impossible mystery of your own, I want to tell it. Send your accounts to mycreepyencounter@gmail.com. Your story might just be the one that keeps someone else awake tomorrow night. Leave a comment below. Tell me which of tonight's cases haunts you the most. I'll be down there in the thread, waiting. I'm the Midnight Rider. Watch where you step, and don't let the shadows catch you off guard. Stay safe out there. Good night.